So let's talk about managing talent to future-proof your business. What do we mean by future-proofing? Well, future-proofing is the process of anticipating the future to minimize the effects of disruption. Okay, but I'm going to make one change to that definition, which I think is from the dictionary. Future-proofing is the process of anticipating possible future scenarios, because unfortunately, we can never really know exactly what's going to happen. So all we can really do is reduce uncertainty by making reasonable estimations or predictions of what might happen. In an ideal world, of course, we'd just cut the off unknown, and then, well, we'd know. But this is not an ideal world. So if we switch over to thinking about talent within an organization for a minute, if we think about preparing our business for the future, we can broadly say that we have talent within the business, or talent that we've acquired, and we can pop that along the bottom of my page. We also have talent required. That's a bit more tricky to estimate. We can add that to the left of my page like this. And like all good consultants and people who work with data and analytics, when you've got two data points, it just makes sense to represent them in a matrix. So let's turn this into a 4-quadrant matrix. If we think about the talent that we've got within the business, we probably know a lot about some of the people, but perhaps very little about others. And so we can sort these into knowns and unknowns. And similar, with the talent that we might require in the future, we can do the same. We might know the specifics of some of what we require in the future. For example, our operations department is expanding, so we're going to need more people there. But we also might know very little about other parts of the business. How will automation and AI and digital transformation affect how many people we need in different parts of the organization? Very difficult to predict some of that. So now that we've got 4 quadrants, and we can shade them in a little just to show them, down on the bottom left there, we know very little about both the talent that we've got and the talent that we need. So some companies sit there. The gray, we maybe know one or the other. And our goal then, as business leaders or as HR professionals, is to try as hard as possible to make sure our organizations are in that top right quadrant, the space where we both know the people that we've got, so we know what they're good at, we know their skill sets, we know how to use them in the future, and we also need what talent. We also know what talent we're going to need in the future. So I'm sure everybody knows this term. We live in a VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and so on. It's a way of describing the future, and I think it's a way of describing 2020, the year we're in. If you think about the weather, the picture on my screen right now, when people make weather predictions, there's a concept involved in that called sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Concept itself is not that relevant, but essentially it's the theory of how small changes in a big system create unseen knock-on effects later on in time or further along in the system, the butterfly effect essentially. And when people predict weather, they sort the world into small blocks, and they use data from last year or from yesterday to predict what will happen in each block. Once they have a prediction for a particular block, they can then use that information to extrapolate what will happen in the adjacent blocks. So surprisingly, with weather forecasts, when we look at 7-day weather forecasts, they're actually accurate about 80% of the time. But the closer to present we come, at the 5-day mark, they're accurate over 90% of the time. So let me ask you this: if you walked outside and saw the weather on my slide outside, would you take an umbrella? Most people would probably say no, or they might say yes. And when they walk outside, the weather's different. So the thing is that the more VUCA an environment, the less likely we are to be accurate about our predictions. So I want to play a very, very brief exercise. Now, if we were in an auditorium, there'd be lots of shouting over each other. But since we're in a virtual auditorium, you're on mute, you can just shout the answer at your screen. I want you to shout the color of the text that comes up. Say it aloud as we go through these, right? So if we're in an auditorium, people were shouting blue, other people were shouting red. Now people are shouting blue and orange. What's next? Green, orange. Now people are probably getting it. They're starting to shout red instead of yellow. But as we increase the complexity, we can see that it becomes more and more difficult to do that. And businesses and environments work very similar to that. The more complex an environment, the less likely an organization is going to be equipped and able to respond effectively and quickly to a change in the ecosystem. So as VUCA complexity increases, the organization's ability to respond decreases. So the more difficult it is, the more volatile a system is, the more difficult it is to predict what's required. And the larger your organization or the more complex your industry, the more difficult it's going to be to plan for the future. If we switch focus back to people in our business, in the same way that knowing last year's weather or yesterday's weather helps us predict today's weather, so too does information about the people in our organization help us predict and plan for future scenarios. Now, the type of information I've got on my screen should be relatively easy information for companies to have about their people. But the truth is not many of the companies that we work with certainly have all of this information about all of these people. So do we know John's career ambitions? Do we know Bob's strengths? Do we know Susan's career history? Most companies don't have access to this type of information for everyone. So theoretically, if we talk about the known and the unknown, the people we have in our business should be the known factor. It's the easiest thing to identify, to quantify, and so on. But is it actually known? Or, as my colleague Martin said earlier today, does LinkedIn know more about the talent in your business than you do as a business leader or an HR professional? And in most cases, I think the answer is yes. LinkedIn, Facebook, and other social platforms actually have more data about the people that work in your business than you do in many cases. And so for most businesses, if we visualized what they know about talent and what they know about what talent they're going to require, their matrix looks something like this: a very big area of unknown and a very small area of known. So we have to work on how we're going to shift that to the left and increase the size of the known environment in our organization. Now, if you think about the marketing, manufacturing data that your business might generate and analyze, supply chain, financial information, and so on, would you allow a third party to collect and manage and maintain that information? Probably not, because it's business critical information that's going to drive better decisions. But we don't seem to have the same approach to talent information. And I think this begs the question, whose job is it to manage talent information in your business, information about people? Sure, if you're working in a medium or large organization, you've probably got an HRIS system of some sort. You've probably got an HRIS administrator. So you might say, well, it's their job. I don't think so. Their job is usually to maintain a system, to make sure it's available, it's in line with the SLA in terms of uptime, it's functional, does what it says on the label. But it's usually not their responsibility to take care of the data itself, to make sure that the information in the system is complete, current, and comprehensive for everyone in the business. And so why do we have this problem? Well, managing any data is difficult. I think many of us on this call are involved in some form of data or analytics. It's very difficult working with information, making sure that it's in a format that's going to create insight. But managing talent data is even harder. And we think there's three important challenges to overcome. The first one is scalability. HR departments typically design a process that fits with their strategy, and then they forget to ask the question, how am I going to scale this out across the organization? So they design a leadership development program, they assess a small group of executives, maybe they have good data on that group of people, but what about everyone else? And so one of the issues with designing a process and creating scalability is we end up in a situation with decentralized information. So too many HR teams end up working with Excel as their primary data storage tool. Don't get me wrong, Excel is a great tool. I think it's incredibly powerful for interpreting and working with information, but it's not an effective tool for storing and maintaining data. And I think that's what sometimes happens. So somebody in HR ends up creating a wonderful data set about a big group of important executives within the business, and then they leave, and they were the ones managing that information on their computer, and now they've left, and we have to start all over again. And so we lose that knowledge. So I think usually the demographic and payroll information in an organization is pretty accurate, because otherwise it wouldn't necessarily, we'd know about it because someone wouldn't get paid. But there's usually very little else. And it's the other information that we need about people, which is really going to create value and drive better decision making in terms of preparing for the future. And I think one of the challenges is that as business and as HR professionals, we're competing for attention. We're not competing for attention with other HR systems. We're competing with the challenges of the person's job, with the demands from their manager. We're competing with Netflix, and we're competing with Facebook. We're competing with their children. And we're losing because we don't create the right incentives that motivate people to keep their information in our organizations up to date. So what can we do about that? Well, if we create the right incentives to drive the right behavior, we can do this more successfully. The challenge is the incentive itself. And this is something that LinkedIn, Facebook, and others do very well. Why do people willingly give companies like LinkedIn their information? It's because there's a clear incentive. I put my information into LinkedIn, I create my profile, and as a byproduct of that exercise, I'm able to connect with colleagues, I can connect with my industry, I can ultimately stay visible in a marketplace of opportunity, and that's my incentive for doing it. In organizations, though, we don't generally provide the same types of incentives when we implement an HR process or a system. So from an incentive perspective, the biggest incentive we can create is an opportunity for personal and professional growth in our organizations. Now, all of the research around engagement surveys, looking at why people leave organizations, is often related to personal and professional growth opportunities, big area of concern. So we have to kind of consider, do employees in our business see their careers within our organization like the top of this graphic or like the bottom of this graphic? So are they going to blossom and grow, or are we not watering them enough and they're not going to blossom and grow? The other thing about incentives is that it's important to incentivize each stakeholder in this process. So what motivates me as an individual is different to me as a manager of other people, or it's different to me as a business leader. So for individuals, finding opportunities for using that data that they provide to you in the talent management systems or tools that you have across that value chain, helping them to use their strengths, understand how they can practice new skills, develop attributes that are important for their success, and ultimately connect with new opportunities in the business. For managers, perhaps it's a little different. For managers, we want to make sure the talent data is available and creates value. So we need to structure it in a way that the data provides meaningful conversations with their teams and ultimately helps them be more effective as a manager in our organization. And for a business, we want to really use that talent data platform to drive better decision making, more efficiently allocate resources, direct our investment in people, and create better hiring decisions. Okay, so cool. Everybody agrees talent data is valuable. So then how do we get employees to regularly update their information on our systems to ensure good quality data? Well, imagine if your HR department ran Facebook as a business. We'd probably get sent a spreadsheet in Excel every 12 months from Facebook, and they'd say, please will you list all of your friends? Please will you tell us all the places you plan to go in the next 12 months and give us one short and black and white headshot of yourself and send it back to us. And then next year we'd probably get a blank spreadsheet. I don't think Facebook would be a very successful business if they took that approach, but they are successful because they also provide value to their users. And so we should take some inspiration from how LinkedIn and Facebook approach this issue of collecting data. So in terms of making it more sustainable as a process of data collection, we have to make it easier to use. So we have to minimize complexity. Complicated HR systems are so 1995, or maybe there's some ERP systems around today that are still a bit like this. But there are many good SaaS solutions out there. There's 10, 15 I could think of that do a great job of minimizing complexity and increasing engagement with the workforce. I think, with the kind of ubiquitous adoption of smartphones and apps in our lives, we've all become, to an extent, UX experts. We all have a certain expectation of how our software should work, how it should look, how it should become intuitive. And we transfer those expectations from our cell phones and from our personal lives into the type of technology that we interact with in the workplace. And following on from the simplicity issue, we also have to provide utility. So is the process that we're asking people to complete adding value to them? Or is it simply a compliance-driven exercise that they must commit time and energy to? So I think agility is key. You don't know what the future is going to hold. So rather than saying, I don't know what the future is, say, I'm going to be responsive to whatever the future might be. And organizational strategies, no matter how well documented they are or how well strategized and planned they are, they generally tend to change. You know, if you think about this year, for example, whose organizational strategy in January of 2020 said in the strategy, we're going to lose 65% of revenue by July, and we're going to close our business for 8 weeks over the busiest period. Like that just was a totally unexpected event. But if we have a foundation of accurate information, of people intelligence, we can use that to make better decisions, to become more responsive, and to adapt more rapidly to the future requirements of our organizations. And so just in closing, as an example here, imagine that we needed to find 2 people that fitted the green context. Here's all the people in our business, and the problem we have, or the role that we've got, requires people who are green. Well, we've got 2 of them already, so that's quite easy if we needed 2. If we needed 4, well, we've got 2 that are green, and perhaps we've got 2 people who are pretty close to being green, so we could develop them for those new roles. And if we needed 4 people, well, if we needed 5 people rather, well, then we'd have to hire from outside because we don't have anyone else in the business. So what tends to happen in these scenarios is, because we don't have great information about our people, a vacancy comes up, a succession issue comes up, and we have to then start the collection of data. We then have to go to the business, try and identify people who are going to fit with that position. Then we have to go and collect the talent information about them. And so the time it takes us to fill those vacancies or solve those problems for our business leaders tends to increase. So if we proactively go out there, create a platform of people intelligence by rethinking how it is that we're approaching the issue of data collection, we'll be in a better position to be more effective at driving scenario planning, anticipating an uncertain future, and essentially overcoming all of the challenges that come with being uncertain. So thanks very much, everyone.